Welcome to Dangerous Wisdom, a journey into mystery and a gateway to the mind of nature and the nature of mind. This is Dr. Nikos, your friendly neighborhood soul doctor, happy to be here with you so that together we can create a culture of wisdom, love, and beauty. Auspicious interbeing to you and yours, my friends, and Koinos Hermes. I am delighted with my guest today, very excited to have Mona Sobhani. She is a cognitive neuroscientist, an author, and an entrepreneur. A former research scientist at the University of Southern California, she holds a doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Southern California, and she completed a post-doctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University with the MacArthur Foundation Law and Neuroscience Project. She is the author of a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It's called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Vox, and other media outlets. She lives in Los Angeles. Mona, welcome to Dangerous Wisdom.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you. And I really did enjoy your book. I thought at first that it was going to be a kind of another run-of-the-mill example. I mean, these things are starting to proliferate where people are reviewing some of the anomalous phenomena in the universe, but it was really an enjoyable read. So I encourage everybody to check it out. And what's wonderful is the particular range and the personal experiences that you didn't just say, well, okay, there's some interesting phenomena out here, but it was such a broad scope. And even considering things that are interesting to me as a philosopher, looking at the philosophy of science itself, which maybe we'll get into a little bit today, and that it's so very relevant that in your field of neuroscience and in science in general, there is a kind of high, a high alertness and dismissiveness to anything that might be characterized as woo-woo. It's a funny thing that in one survey that I saw where they were looking at different academic departments and asking, well, who's most open to these sorts of anomalous phenomena? The philosophers were the least open. So, and it's ironic that if I wrote the same book, it wouldn't carry the same cachet, even though my discipline is the one that is the most really must defend the materialist paradigm.
Oh,
So
wow.
your story, though, is a story of a kind of a big conversion experience in a way, if we could call it that, which is such a hallmark of philosophical life. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about where you were in terms of your worldview and what that meant to you at the time, to what it would be like to consider the kinds of things we're about to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I started off very scientific materialist, so it's how they train us in science, but it's also just Western culture. I think I talk about this a little. Do I talk about the book? I don't know, but I started off college with a little more wonder and awe for the mysteries of the universe. But then by the time I finished graduate school, not only because it was science, but also because it was neuroscience, they really train you that all meaning is created in the brain, that it comes from us, that there's no meaning, external to us. There's no inherent meaning in the external environment, and that everything is random, dead, and meaningless, and our brains are coincidence detectors and storytellers, so they are looking for coincidences, and then they're looking for a way to pull it together and create a story. So by the end of graduate school, I learned to not trust the brain, not to trust our own experiences, our subjective experiences, and definitely not to think that anything magical or spiritual or mystical could exist. I was pretty arrogant and very opposed to those kinds of things.
It's really interesting when you say, I mean, what an effect that this has on us, that science, instead of creating intimacy with experience, can create a disconnection where we're now not trusting our experience, and at the same time, an arrogance that still I do know. I mean, what a
I know. Yeah.
multifaceted situation to be in, right?
Yeah, that was the interesting one I came up against in the whole experience. This whole like worldview flip was I'm so certain that I know, but then we can't trust our perceptions. And so yeah, it just the absurdity of that just became obvious to me over the course of the experience.
Yeah. And what is interesting too is that so here you have this deep-seated paradigm, and there's a kind of it's interesting to me that you do talk about a little bit issues that I would connect with philosophy of science, but what's not stated overtly is that science is always the servant of philosophy. It's just that most scientists don't want to confess their metaphysical speculations, or they take them to just be reality,
Mhm.
as opposed to asking the question, wait a second, if I'm doing science in service of some kind of philosophical view of what a human being is, what reality is, what is that view, and is it a good one? But it's just here it is. It's as if, well, no, that this is just reality, and we're proceeding along
Yes.
as, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I wasn't a student of philosophy. I was actually very turned off by philosophy. I wasn't interested in it at all. And um so I wasn't even aware that this was an issue or a thing. And that was one of the surprising things of when I started reading and exploring in these topics. And this came up that, hey, this thing that science is based on is a philosophy of, a bunch of assumptions about the true nature of reality, but that those are just assumptions. And then looking beyond the field of science, finding there was all this dialogue and discourse and no agreement on what is that a fundamental. And then that was shocking, And then I thought, oh dear, we don't actually know. We've just decided that we're going to go with this one, and we're basing all of our science on it. But if it's wrong, then a lot of things are wrong. But yeah, that's why I started, when I talk to other neuroscientists, or I always say, like, you should really read things other than just neuroscience, because there's a lot more to know. And a lot of the assumptions that we make blindly in science, you wouldn't make quite as blindly if you know, explored philosophy and a little bit more of the humanities.
right, yeah. I mean that's something that I've heard. Dean Radin, I interviewed Dean Radin, and I was asking him, what do you what would you tell young scientists? And he said, well, study philosophy, so you understand that it is undergirding what we're doing. And it's interesting too, this
Mhm.
you're talking about a shift, and you write in your book about the way that there is also an identification process. This is something that people don't always realize, that how invested our sense of self is in our jobs and in the kinds of views of the world that our jobs then have to get us to accept. If we are engaged in certain kind of capitalist activity, we have to believe that certain things about people, that they're motivated by money, that we're homo economicus. And so similarly, if you're in the sciences, there's a kind of identification. I am a scientist, and there's a lot of levels to that. Look, I'm smart, I have a PhD, I know what the brain is, and I'm a materialist. And it's interesting
Mhm.
how that, if for you were able to sense what a confrontation with the problems of identity that is. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? You frame it in the book as the old me versus the new me. The old me who had these views, and then, something comes and confronts it, and we could just push it
Mhm.
away, but you turn toward it.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a lot of struggle and a lot of time. I guess not that long, but it felt like forever. It felt like an eternity to come to that insight. But um, yeah, I was having a hard time. I was opening up to these new ideas, right? I'm like, all right, let me explore a philosophy of spirituality. Let me have these experiences, let me get some readings. So I'm opening up, and then I start feeling like honestly, it was like my nervous system was on fire. Like I was uncomfortable all the time. And I was um, frantic in a way, like internally frantic. And I didn't know why. I mean, I knew why because I was exploring these topics, but I didn't know why. Like, oh, so what if I'm being open-minded? What's the big deal? But it was a physiological reaction. And then I think, I mean, I sort of came to the inside of my own, but I also sort of had a psychic tell me, a psychic psychotherapist tell me. But part of it was I had been practicing mindfulness for a while, so I did start noticing my thoughts. And before this journey, like I didn't even stop to notice my own thoughts, right? But with I started really taking note of them as I was going through the journey, and that's when I found myself, like, if I was crying on the floor because I'm surrounded by books on reincarnation or something, like I'd be like, why am I crying? And I'd be like, I'm crying, oh my God, I'm the kind of person who reads this stuff now. And then, old me would have just probably wallowed in that. But with my new skill, my new mindfulness skills, I was trying to exercise. I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Right. And I just kept asking, what does that mean? Why? With every thought I had. And so with that, I just kept pushing it. And I thought, okay, what does that mean? What kind of person is that? And it's somebody who's, I'm like open-minded. And then the other side of it was like stupid. And that's when I realized, I was like, oh yeah, that's one of my fundamental beliefs. I guess my conditioned beliefs is that anybody who believes in anything that's not science, hard science based, or that is spiritual or stuff is stupid. And so then I was crying because I thought I was stupid now. And so I had to, and then, go through, what does that mean? Why did I think I was smart? I did all these kinds of like mental exercises. And part of it was, oh yeah, I'm a scientist. Why did I go into science? Part of it was to understand the world. But if you're, and it's really hard to do, but be honest with yourself. Why did you go for a PhD in science? It's because I loved saying I'm a neuroscientist, like I love the respect that comes with it, the authority. And I had to just really own that and face it. And it was hard.
It's interesting that you have this this deep discomfort in a way. I mean, there's so much that's alive in that story. One, that you're there and you're having an intense emotional experience because there's an identity issue, which is I am now the kind of person who reads this material, whereas before I would have been the kind of person who just would have dismissed it with an eye roll without reading it. And it reminds me of an interaction that Rupert Sheldrake had. You know who he is now.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Which you might not have before. But, he was friends with Dan Dennett going back to when they were in, was it Oxford or Cambridge? I think they're both Cambridge boys. So they'd known each other for all these years. And Sheldrake says, to get into it, that's the equivalent of Ivy League here. Dennett's a well-known philosopher. And so they were having some discussion about some anomalous phenomena. And Sheldrake said, look, I'd be happy to debate you publicly. And well, and Dennett said, yeah, sure, fine. And he said, well, let me give you time to go back through the literature. And he said, well, I haven't read the literature. And he said, well, then let me give you time to read it. I don't need to read it. And Sheldrake thought, well, now how are we going to have a debate? You haven't even read the material. And that reminds me too of Schmeidler's distinction. Have you ever heard of the sheep and goats?
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, right, which is a biblical reference. Mm-hmm. But Schmeidler had this idea that there are some people who, and now I don't know that she framed it in terms of existential identity issues. That we really come to identify as a certain kind of person, but at any rate, it's implicit there. And I know it sounds weird to think of, the sheep or the mindless people who, because that's what we say sheeple, or the. So I wish she had not put it that way, but it was a biblical reference actually, because it meant that the sheep were the ones listening to the divine, and the goats were too stubborn to serve the divine. We don't have to speak in religious terms, but it is a religious reference. In spiritual terms, it is to say those who are willing to hear the call of their soul or the great mystery or whatever it might be, versus those who are stubbornly resistant to it. And so her proposal was, for those who don't know this, you do, but that certain kinds of people would not encounter anomalous phenomena, because anytime they would get close to it, something in them would steer them in another direction. So the discomfort that you were sitting with is the very thing that makes a goat a goat and keeps them away from it ordinarily. And you had to go through the unpleasantness of being with a discomfort in yourself in order to see if you could face a greater truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, before this, I was not aware of, all the literature connecting mind and body, and even the more recent like somatic psychology, things that are becoming repopularized. I wasn't familiar with any of that, but I became familiar through this experience because I started looking into it after this. But I just realized, I was like, yeah, why is my nervous system on fire? Like, why am I so uncomfortable? And I wasn't even that in touch with my body, but at the time, but it was, so pronounced that I couldn't not notice it. So like, even when I would sit in meditation, like, it was just too much. It would help me calm down for a while, but it was not working. And I remember thinking something is wrong, like with me, something is wrong. So yeah. So, and then I thought, well, I have to figure out what's wrong.
Right. And it's not just in this case because of the way that the culture is constructed. I mean, this is part, you could say, of the immune system of the pattern of insanity. To the extent that you have an unhealthy culture, a culture that's not sane, it can't perpetuate itself without some kind of immune system that keeps out anything that would destabilize it. Mm-hmm. And so we have to have educational systems, for instance, that train scientists in certain ways so that you're minimizing anything that would be too far outside of what's accepted. And that in a larger sense, that's also holding together structures that are political and economic. And so it's very similar. This is a parallel that you don't necessarily bring out, but I think it's important to recognize that we are idiots if we think that, say, ESP might be real. And we're also idiots. In fact, we might even be bigger idiots if we think that capitalism is not the best system that you can possibly have. These are very related things. It's only idiots would think that, because look, if you don't have capitalism, it's Stalin. And if you don't believe, if you don't accept materialism, then when someone gets shot, if there's a mass shooting, you're going to run out there with crystals and try to fix them, as opposed to taking them to a. These are the things that we get painted. Yeah. So it's part of this kind of subtle form of control that you self-censor. You're the one. No one's standing there telling you that you're stupid. You're feeling. Yeah, I'm stupid.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting how it works. It's very similar to Chomsky and Herman and their analysis of the media. That, first of all, if we think that the New York Times is the craziest liberal thing there is, then there's not going to be anything more liberal than that. And secondly, whenever you're writing for the New York Times, you're never going to have the sense that someone's censoring you and telling you that you can't criticize the system in certain ways. You just wouldn't have the job that you have.
Right. Yeah.
So you don't get a job as a cognitive neuroscientist, already pretty much in line.
Yeah, well, kind of. But I think also with my my personal project that I launched, when I went to interview my colleagues to see, because I got curious, like, do any of them believe in have they ever experienced anomalous phenomena? Are they spiritual? Are they religious? Like, I had no idea. We never talked about that stuff. Yeah. I found that they were way more open. First of all, they all had experiences in some way or another. And they were more, I mean, if you're well-trained in science, you'll always say science can't measure everything and we don't know all the answers, which is what all of them said. And then it's just like that the tension arises when you bring up something specific that the culture has stigmatized, and then everyone gets uncomfortable and then they back away. Or, I mean, in private, like I talk about in the book, in private, people will talk about anything and they'll admit anything. But if you put us on a stage in front of people, then it becomes a little bit different. So it's actually a lot of people that go into neuroscience, I mean, we're really interested in human behavior and come in with a lot of true curiosities. And a lot of them are very philosophical, that's why I choose neuroscience over other branches of science, I think. But you don't get fed that. That doesn't get nurtured in graduate school. So, and then you just become busy. And so sometimes that falls to the wayside, unfortunately. And that's sort of what happened, I think, with me. Like, I came in with some amount of awe and wonder for the universe. But by the end
Yeah.
of graduate school, it's kind of like beaten out of you. And it really is like a transformation of the way you think and the way you look at the world. And you start categorizing things and breaking it down into data and looking for correlations. And your mind turns into a literal computer. And how would I do statistics on like this thing? And that's how you start operating. And that was another interesting thing. I didn't write about it in the book, but one thing that over the course of this whole transformation is watching the way that I think change greatly. And so like when I started it was very scientific and very categorical and very data driven and very numbers. And that's why I approached the problem initially with like, what does the science say? Where's the proof? Where's the mechanism? And then, by the end, or actually it's not the end, right? I'm still in this, but then I started making room for quality assessments and mythology and symbolic meaning and things like that. And then the way I think completely changed. And so, and I'm sure it's continuing to evolve, but that was a really interesting thing that happened along the way that I didn't even notice how scientific and mechanistic my thinking had become. And actually a good example of that is I used to read a lot of fiction when I entered graduate school. Like fiction was my favorite thing to read. And by the time I left, I had stopped reading fiction. I just read so much science. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting on again, there's just a lot in what you're saying. One of the things, of course, I want to clarify that there are a few things that work in the way science indoctrinates people who become scientists. There are people like Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson, no question that and Dan Dennett, who's a philosopher actually, but they do have very firm commitments and would not be afraid to tell you in private that they think that you're crazy, right? But then you have this other issue, which is what Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science, pointed out, that the education of the scientist proceeds in a dogmatic fashion. And he was quite comfortable with saying that because from his view, and of course, there's a big question of what this means historically in the present. Historically, in the past, if we look at the past, Kuhn was saying that dogmatism clearly allows for innovation in science. It's an open question whether or not that it would be better to not have the dogmatism. But what he was saying is that scientists are trained in the what he called normal science. You are given paradigms to learn from and master, and you stay working in the framework that you're given until essentially science, your field or the group of scientists have a sort of nervous breakdown and decide that they have to account for data that they've been suppressing or calling noise or whatever it might be. And that allows them to become creative. But at that point, they're not really doing science the way they were trained anymore. There's something else that has happened. And so it could be that we need a paradigm shift, but it also could be that part of what is missing here is pluralism. An interesting thinker I really recommend. I'd actually like to, reminds me I should reach out to him and see if I can interview him, is Hasok Chang. Have you ever heard of Hasok Chang?
No.
He's super, super interesting. But one of the things that he looked at is the shift from the phlogiston theory to the theory of Lavoisier. This is a big moment in the history of science where Lavoisier says, no, there's no such thing as phlogiston. And he comes up with this oxygen idea. And Hasok Chang says, the thing is, when you study the actual history of it, I think you'll have a very hard time believing that Lavoisier just had a better case, that it was just, scientifically, it made more sense. And he said, no, I don't think so. And so he goes over it very carefully. And then he shows that there were all these sorts of experiments that have been lost to us, and that if you imagine the phlogiston theory had hung on, we might have advanced, say, 50 or even 100 years ahead of what we did, because Lavoisier is at the end of the, of course, unfortunately, he was guillotined. So he's the end of the 1700s. And then from that time to Thomson is like 100 years. And Hasok Chang makes a pretty clear case that even if phlogiston had just been allowed to be around, and people would have, instead of just had this dominant view where it has to be this way, that we might have made an advancement. So part of what might help here is if scientists were to allow pluralism. And the joke that Chang often makes to illustrate this, which I think is such a wonderful one, is he says, you got two boys who are in school, and their teachers call them into the principal's office, and they say, each of you was asked to write an essay, and you both wrote an essay on the family dog. And the essays are exactly the same. So clearly you cheated. And the older brother says, no, we didn't. It's the same dog. So I don't know if that makes sense, but the idea is, why would we assume? We certainly don't assume that two people writing an essay on the same dog should write the same essay. Why would we assume that two people studying the brain should be using the same materials, the same hypotheses, the same machines, or whatever it might be, the same approach, and that they're only going to get this one same description, as opposed to considering other possibilities?
Yeah, you mean like the background philosophy also, or just
it could be, right?
Yeah,
because you could have if you look at the Copenhagen interpretation, that's a whole philosophy about how reality works and how science is done. Bohm has a very different philosophy. You get the same predictive results, but you have a very different view of what the cosmos is and what it means. And even Chang argues, for instance, that there's nothing wrong with, like, if you are trained as a physicist, you have to learn Newtonian mechanics. You also have to learn quantum mechanics. You also have to learn relativity theory. Now, these are completely different. And you would not use quantum physics to launch a rocket to the moon. It would be ridiculous. But you've got three very different paradigms in an important sense. Why is it that we find that so hard to accommodate in other fields? And so why couldn't the neuroscientists be at least allowed to pursue something that is not within, or even encouraged? I mean, that would be the ideal case. But it's just one way of thinking about how limiting it can be.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I was going to say initially that it would make it so, as it stands right now, there's one assumption about the philosophy, right? It's scientific materialism, so that never needs to be stated. And so it makes it easier, even though the model doesn't ultimately work to explain all classes of evidence, but it makes it easier because you never have to qualify your experiment by saying this is whatever. Our interpretation is based on this philosophical understanding of reality.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, they could add that as a, onto the paper, like, this is what, our interpretation is using that, or they could even do an exercise of interpreting it with a few different philosophies.
Yeah.
That would be even more interesting. Well, I'm organizing I'm trying to organize. We'll see if we can do it, just to pull it off, at the largest neuroscience conference. We have one every year. I actually stopped going, but my collaborator and I wanted to organize a panel on alternative models of consciousness. So it's kind of addressing that of, like, yes, we have these mainstream models in neuroscience, which are great, whatever, they do the best they can in explaining the evidence that they take into consideration, but there's all these new models being proposed that do use other philosophical foundations for reality and being published in academic journals. So we want to have a panel on that, but we'll see if they'll approve it.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. And it's because it's interesting how I don't think this was ever explained to you as I would read it as a philosopher, that it is metaphysical speculation. That what science acts like it's doing is excluding metaphysics, but yet there is this sheer speculation that the metaphysics of the universe are this thing called matter, which we haven't even figured out what it is yet. We don't know what that is. Like dark matter enters 5 seconds ago on the scientific spectrum of things, and we suddenly realize we don't know what we're talking about. But that on top of that we're already assuming metaphysically that every new bit of data will further confirm the metaphysical view that we have. I mean, that's just the ground assumption, because nobody's trying to say, well, let's test against it. Let's see if we can overturn it. Let's see if there's a way to overturn this metaphysical speculation. But you actually give evidence, and maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about this, of Kepler, not the old Kepler, but the new Kepler. Is it Joachim Kepler, is that his first name?
Joachim,
Yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, maybe you could talk about there, because there is a philosophical view, a different metaphysical view that actually gives you empirical prediction that you
Right.
could, maybe you could lay that
Yeah,
out, his view. It's a really
that was,
cool.
yeah, he does it. He uses cosmopsychism, I think. So man, it's been a while since I looked at that, even though I put it in the book. But his, the general assumption in neuroscience is that consciousness arises from the brain, and that memories are stored in the brain, even though memory and consciousness are really difficult topics to study in neuroscience. Like we haven't actually nailed them down. So I found this paper. I think I went to just search when I was writing the book, like, are there any other models of consciousness, like whatever? And I put a bunch of different philosophies in, and I found this paper by Joachim Kepler. He wrote a bunch of papers, actually, that were just really interesting. First proposing cosmopsychism as like a alternative philosophy, and then saying, what if there is a field, something like, it could be electromagnetic, I think he argued in that paper, but it's something like the 0 point field that just runs through everything, but that is comprised of, I don't think he called it explicitly consciousness, but he describes the field as having two components. So one would be physical matter, which we are familiar with, and the other is a phenomenological component, and that was kind of the thing that brings quality to consciousness, right? That like thing that we can't measure, that we can't derive into matter and break it up into parts and reduce it. So, it's this, that there's both of these things in the field, and that our brains are receivers that interact with the field on a constant basis and download these phenomenal states and also, whatever else. And so he actually went through like the entire literature of neuroscience, and he used larger scale electrical communication like that happens in the brain. So parts of the brain have to coordinate with other parts when they're doing stuff, like they go into resonance with each other. So he went through the literature, the memory and consciousness literature specifically, and proposed this model to say, oh, when it's in this state, when these brain regions are in this frequency and they're aligned together, like maybe that's when it lines up with the field downloads a phenomenal state, whatever state of consciousness, and then it's also capable of uploading, and that's how he explains like how everything ends up back in the field is because there's also, as in addition to downloading, there's an uploading function. So it's really interesting because I haven't seen many theories like that published in peer review. I think it was Frontiers of Psychology, which is a pretty mainstream psychology journal, and since then there's been a few other similar papers published by different scientists, so that are similar. Like they propose some sort of I think usually it's electromagnetic, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a quantum field. It varies depending on the theory, but just saying instead of our brains producing consciousness, that they are receivers, or that they interact with something that maybe we can't measure yet, or maybe it's whatever, it depends on theory, but interacts, and that's how you're seeing these new models being proposed that try to account for other classes of evidence that's come up. And I think especially with, actually, I think I just read a newer paper with Joachim Kepler, and he linked up with one of the psychedelic researchers, and they were explaining them a similar model in regards to ayahuasca evidence, and so kind of trying to explain like a psychedelic experience in that way. And it was actually, yes, in that paper, I remember I highlighted this and like circled it, and I made a note to come back, because they explicitly say in the introduction, they make a whole point in saying like a thing about science, and saying like, yes, we believe in evidence that you can measure and this and that, but we write this paper with, acknowledging that we don't know everything in science, and that in the history of science, there have been things that have been dismissed because we couldn't measure them. And then we could measure them later, like microscopes being able to see germs or whatnot. So they kind of make this whole case in the beginning to say, we're going to speculate a little bit in this paper, bear with us, but saying just because we can't measure or we don't have evidence for things right now doesn't mean that we won't in the future. And, these are our thoughts on it. And I just thought like it was so fantastic to finally read that in a paper. I thought it was really, really great.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where you can see why there is all this concern too, because there are people everywhere talking about energy and vibration. The concept is used to explain so much that it ends up explaining nothing, in my view. It's just
Right.
if it's all energy, then I don't even know what we're talking about. And yet there's clearly something here about resonance. And this year, I'm sure you saw, we've had two very interesting papers, right? One by James Pang, and the other by, I think, Yiben Shu, and both were looking at how how resonance in the brain and how the topological or geometrical features of the brain are more important than the connectome in a certain way. It was almost like a test of the connectome hypothesis, that we have this habitual notion that.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know what that was.
Yeah, I lost you.
No, that's okay. So let me just go back to. So where we left off was that you were talking about reading Kepler's paper, and I'll just pick up from there as if that's where you just finished off. We might have gotten a little bit more than that, but just we'll start there.
Wait 1 second. If for um just in case it's mine, do you mind if I'm gonna plug it in
Okay.
to my router? Yeah.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I'm gonna turn my Wi-Fi off.
Okay.
Let me make sure this is plugged in before I do that. And okay, hopefully this won't disconnect. Oh, hi. Am I back?
Yeah, I think so. You there? Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay, it's plugged in. There we go.
Okay. All right. So what I was thinking again about how interesting it is that you have a clear indication that there's something important about resonance, and at the same time, the idea of vibration and energy and resonance is so pervasive and so casually used as to become almost useless in some ways. But there's something that's important, and I just wanted to ask the question of whether you had seen James Peng's research or Yibin Shu's research on resonance in the brain. This is kind of like a really new, this just came out the past month or two. So we have the kind of habitual idea that the brain produces mind by means of what happens in the connectome, by means of we have these atomized bits, neurons and other support structures, and they fire and talk to each other, and they're focused in centers where there are particular things that might be associated with them. We're not like totally facultative, this thing only does this, but we understand there could be multiple functions, but nonetheless, it's what you could call a connectome approach. And what these two different teams of researchers doing two different things did, especially Peng is much more going head to head with the connectome view. What they showed is that it is resonance in the brain, that it's much more like as if the old view is looking at a vibrating violin string and trying to explain what's happening by looking at a point on the string, rather than understanding that it's the whole string. These are the so-called eigenmodes, that there's something about the geometry, the topography of the brain that is responsible for explaining how brain produces mind. And so they went through all kinds of, I mean, this was like a huge, it's a landmark paper. You probably would find it really exciting. I can share it with you. And then
send it to me. I was trying to like write it down, but if you
James Peng at Monash University in Australia. Then the other group, what they found were these kinds of, they found spiraling resonance patterns over the surface of the brain that were clearly doing something that was not being explained simply by the connectome view alone.
Okay.
And then another study that's not exactly related to this, but is super interesting, and that one was about that was done in Estonia, and they were looking at the death process and finding brain activity, of course, beyond when you would think it should be there, and wondering what that means. There's an interesting documentary on the death process that I think you'll probably be fascinated with, that's called Tukdam. And that's Tukdam is a Tibetan word for when an advanced meditator is trained in Tukdam. A lot of advanced spiritual practitioners will know when they're going to die. And so the practitioners of Tukdam will, especially if they live in contemporary setting, they will tell their family, I don't want to go to the hospital, I'm going to die. Then they'll start meditating more, and they'll try to be in a meditative pose and in a meditative state when death happens. And it's fascinating because if you go in there, of course, we understand that body decomposition surely can vary, but in these conditions, which is in India when it's hot, there really should be decomposition, and these bodies are still, and the people look like they're just alive and meditating. It's really amazing, but they've been dead for like a week.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And the Dalai Lama has, for years tried to collaborate with the scientists, because their attitude is very dismissive, because they're sure that the whole reincarnation story, you guys are, let's grow up. And so he always said, I'm happy to run tests because we are an empirical philosophy. This is not a philosophy of dogmatic belief.
Yes. Yeah.
So they could never coordinate an advanced practitioner dying and getting the machinery there, because it's like some yogi in the cave, whatever. So they found a guy in Taiwan, and this actually made mainstream news, although probably not the New York Times, but this guy in Taiwan was a monk and a scholar monk, and so when he died, the alert went out, and they sent, and you're thinking it's dumb because he's in the morgue for 2 weeks when the EEG machine gets there, and they say, well, we're going to measure him. And so everyone's having a laugh, but there was faint electrical activity. And 2 weeks in a morgue means zero electrical. But there was a measurable activity using an EEG machine when there should be nothing like a living person, but something there. And this monk was supposedly had been instructed to try to linger. And the same thing with some of these others in Tukdam. But anyway, so I guess we won't talk about those studies then, because you haven't seen them, but it is interesting to see that also what that illustrates is even what we think we're so certain about, we don't know. I mean, here is this phenomenon, or let's just say a hypothesis connected to measurable phenomena that is not part of the explanatory model that we have. We don't, the explanatory model doesn't have resonance in it. There was also, of course, the Hungarian guy, Georgi, Is it what was his name? Where he wrote about rhythms in the brain. It's
I
really
don't know that one, but go ahead.
no,
Sorry.
no, please, yeah, go.
I was just gonna, yeah, there was, I'm trying to remember her name. There was a researcher, a scientist who was looking at this. And they came up, oh, I did put in the book, the connectome harmonic. They were looking at resonance in a way, and she's still doing it. And she's looking at a range of states of consciousness, like from anesthesia to psychedelics to normal states. So I do think, and when I was in graduate school, I remember being disenchanted with fMRI research because of this reason, because I thought this is ridiculous. We're doing linear regression on the brain. It can't possibly, it's like the most complicated thing in the universe as that we know of so far, and we're using linear regression, and like we keep identifying the same regions active for everything. And I was just so disenchanted by it, because I was like, what is this even telling us? It's like nothing. So I mean, I'm glad to see the field moving towards other theories, because what we have is so insufficient.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about where we both have an interest. We have a lot of like strange, interesting resonance. I lived in LA for some time. I lived in the Valley for a little while, but then Hollywood. You're on the West Side now, which is where my favorite sushi restaurant used to be. And we both have a kind of horse connection, and we were both very committed materialists. When I started out in philosophy. So I started out wanting to be Nikola Tesla when I was a little kid, and building motors out of
Noble
shoeboxes.
goal.
Yes. Yeah, he was like a hero figure to me. And then I thought, well, no, I got interested in philosophy, and then I thought, well, but science tells us about reality. And so I kind of had the view that is the exact wrong view, that philosophy is the servant of the sciences, and that you go to the sciences to find out about reality. So I spent a lot of time in this very dismissive materialistic paradigm. But the thing is, I was still so drawn to philosophy as it more rarely is now, unless you're talking to somebody who's in one of the more active traditions. Like there aren't Platonists today. The school fell apart, but there are people who still practice in Buddhist philosophy or Taoist philosophy. So those lines are still alive. And so then we know that philosophy is a way of life. If you read Plato, and now we have scholarship to show this, he felt that it was a way of life, and it was about a transformative experience. And of course, Plato had been part of a society steeped in using psychedelics. And so he had taken part of the mysteries, which we believe to have been a psychedelic, hugely transformative experience. And part of what he was trying to do, it seems, is to understand how we could facilitate that kind of transformation and make it matter in the culture. Because there was far more, shall we say, a permeation of psychedelic experience in that culture than there is in ours. I mean, we think, oh, it's psychedelic renaissance. And here's Plato saying, look, you can have everybody take the psychedelics and you still have Donald Trump. I mean, you might pray that he's going to, he'll see the light. Yeah. But so what is that? Yeah. And I think that's part of what you're looking at, because both of us have a recognition that something in us could be very uncomfortable. And what Plato and other teachers want to say is, not just uncomfortable, but if you try to force a transformative experience for which you are not prepared, it will either not deliver everything it could have, or it will leave you traumatized. It's potentially something that can leave you quite shaken. You're not ready for the identity shift.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What have you been thinking about and writing about? I mean, I know some of it, some part I'm asking as look at me asking.
I told you to ask.
What could it be?
Yeah.
But of course I've read some of it, but I just right now in the moment, what have you been thinking about? What is interesting to you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about transformative experiences, and I mean, specifically ones that really flip your worldview or cause you to question how you see reality and how you interact with it, and the range of that, because I've not only seen it in myself, but since my transformation, I've met a lot of people who, I've had a lot of old friends reach out to me who I knew from undergraduate or from, I met through my friends when they were in law school or whatever, and, we used to party together, but they're reaching out to me now, and they've all had like spiritual awakenings, and their stories are really varied, and how open and how long it took for them is all varied. And so I just kind of got interested in that, and like, what is it for each of us? Because for some people, it takes a really long time to, so, it's kind of like it knocks on your door and you can just keep ignoring it sometimes for as long as you want if it's a subtle knock. But sometimes for some people, it's not. It's like an energetic experience, like a Kundalini awakening or something. And then in those cases, you can't just ignore it, or you could try, but something is physically going on with you. So you have to, usually these people, try to figure out what's going on with them. And and they come up against an explanation that doesn't have a foundation in their understanding of reality or in their worldview. And so some people like that have reached out to me just because of my book. And I'm blown away by these stories because they'll be like, oh, I was like a conservative, I was a whatever, I was this or that. And then, I didn't believe in any of this stuff, but then I had a Kundalini awakening and my whole, and then they kind of, it was interesting to hear people, the range of, I accepted it and I went into it. And then other people being like, I thought I was crazy. I thought I had schizophrenia. I lost all my friends and family, it just was so widely varied. And I was thinking about it in context of the psychedelic renaissance happening because last year I had a really powerful psychedelic experience where, I had read the entire literature. I had done psychedelics before. I had already had a spiritual awakening. My worldview had already been flipped. So I didn't think there was much more that could shock me or whatever, but that was naive. So yeah, I had an experience that was very just deeper than I don't even know how to say it. Like, it was so much outside of the purview of what I could have imagined I could experience. It wasn't negative, but it was just, it didn't have to be. Just the fact that I could experience something. It was like going into 3D and then coming back into 2D. And that experience was so shocking that, it really untethered me for a while, not in a like, a crazy way, but just my understanding of reality was a little like, whoa, really? Like, what do we live in? Like, what is this? Like, really, like I started to feel that instead of just thinking about it intellectually. My feeling of reality was shaken, and it wasn't negative. It was just such an interesting experience for me. But I kept thinking about afterward, like how prepared I even thought I was, but that with the psychedelic renaissance, and I'm a big supporter of psychedelics and the Renaissance, but I just started thinking, what about these people that are going to go in for depression, and they're from the Midwest or they come from like conservative communities, and they're going to have an experience like I had, or even worse, like there's other experiences you could have where, you encounter an entity, or you encounter the divine, or you encounter something that questions or you come to understand that consciousness is a part of everything. Everything's conscious. The tables, and there have been studies recently published looking at this, saying people who take psychedelics, at least in the West, or at least in these studies that have come out, they tend to have more non-physicalist beliefs. So more belief in reincarnation, more belief that consciousness is fundamental, that consciousness doesn't die with death of the physical body. Like, people tend to believe these things when they come out of psychedelic experiences, and a large number of people. And so I just started thinking about, like, what is going to happen when these people come out. It, like, of course, idealist me is like, oh, cool, great, we're going to like flip all these people and they're going to be be non-physicalist. But then my heart breaks for them, like going back to their communities where they're going to be so different. Sorry, I'm getting emotional about it. Like, they're going to be so different from everyone, and like lonely, because who will understand what they've been through? So I guess I'm like a little worried about that. Even though I think, in the end, I'm sure everything will be fine, but it does, psychedelics, and that's a choice. They can bring loneliness because they give you this experience that you, first of all, can't put into language. And sometimes it's hard to find other people, you have to find like a community of people who've had that experience. But then also there's people more people than ever have had spiritual awakenings also. There was like not that recent, but it was like 2009 Gallup poll or something. And compared to the 60s, it showed that the number of people who've had some sort of like, spiritual awakening or emergence has doubled. Like it's a large percentage. So it seems like this is happening to more and more people, because of the introduction of Eastern philosophies and cultures and spiritual traditions into the West. And then now with psychedelics, you kind of see this starting to happen. And it's just, it can be ontologically shocking for people when they have some sort of sudden experience, right? Some sort of moment in time, transformative experience. Those are the kinds of things that no matter how much you're prepared, you're never prepared because you cannot imagine what it's like. You have to experience it to know. And so I've just been thinking about that a lot because it seems like that's where we're headed. And I don't have answers to it. I don't know. I just kind of think it's an interesting thing that we should probably start thinking about now ahead of time and like how to support people. Because I went to look into literature to see, is there any research on like if someone has a spiritually transformative experience, or even after psychedelics, after you've had a worldview flipping experience, then what? Do you start, how does your daily life change? How does your relationship with the people in your life change? What changes for you, and is it positive or negative, and what kind of resources, did you have or wish you had that helped you through it? And that research is just starting to be done. There's been so little of that research. It's like not funded at all. There's just a handful of papers. And there's just a few people that I know that are working on it, which is a great start, but yeah, it's going to take a while to do. So I just started thinking about that, like, well, what resources are we going to need to help people get through these?
Yeah. Well, there's so much in what you're saying. One of the things, to say it again, part of what Plato was trying to tell us is the medicines aren't going to do it by themselves, because what you bring to them is going to determine what they can do with you. And one of the people who looked at this, of course, is Rick Strassman, classically, because he was administering the psychedelic and then asking, how do we make sense of it? What would you do with it in your life? And his view was, well, these people had powerful spiritual experiences, but none of them, and these were, he's giving people high doses at the top end. And his conclusion was none of them were visionary experiences. Now, there's a distinction to be made. You can have a big experience. It can feel really wonderful, but to what degree can it really inform your life and the life of your community? And he turned to his own tradition and said, well, in the Jewish tradition, which he had been disconnected from, but he returned to it and said, well, in this tradition, you had to be trained to have a visionary experience. But when you had them, then you could inform the culture as a whole. It's very similar that, people can take, and Ram Dass found this out, right? That you can take all kinds of LSD and you're not going to come to your community with the kind of information that Buddha had just by sitting down under a tree. I mean, Buddha comes back and says, let me explain to you, this is how the mind works. This is where suffering comes from. This is how you can train your mind. This is the potentials it has. And he goes through and gives you all this information that then shapes entire cultures. Whereas most of the time we're taking these medicines and we're thinking we're having a big experience, but that's because the context is so anemic now. And I also do believe that that's part of what Plato and Socrates were trying to say. Look, people have, because compare the difference too, that to go through the mysteries, you would prepare for a year to go through the mysteries. And they're looking around at their culture and saying, but why do we have such knuckleheads running the place? I saw this guy at the mysteries and look at what he's doing. He's a tyrant, So they were trying to say, you have to be able to be prepared to receive that information, because if it comes so fast that you can't process it, then you're going to feel like it was big, but that just means it was overwhelming to the ego. And then what will you do with it? How will you be able to help your community with it? And then the most important thing those medicines show us is, I think part of what you were saying is, they just show us that there's more than we thought. And that the wisdom traditions are saying, all the stuff you can do on shrooms, you can do without it. And the best thing they can teach you is that your mind's more powerful than you realize, and then we'll show you how you can do that without those medicines.
Yeah.
So all of those things are at stake. But then there's the deep thing that you're talking about. This It's a wonderful word. It's for those of you who listen to Dangerous Wisdom, ontological shock has come up before. It's a delightful word to throw out on the first date. I've been thinking a lot about ontological shock. And really, have you? Yes,
Yeah.
I'm very deep. What is ontological shock? Well, I've only just started listening to Dangerous Wisdom. So Mona, tell us what ontological shock is, which is an important.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is I was just on a call before that where we jumped on and my friend and I were talking about I mentioned it again and he was like, it's funny, but it's coming up in the media because of the UFO disclosures. They've started. So it's like now that this word ontological shock has hit the mainstream, which is funny. But it's basically like when the way that you understand reality, right? We all interact with reality and then we make sense of it, right? We put it in context in our minds, in our worldview, or whatever. And ontological shock is kind of when you come up against something that is like in contrast or clashes with that you can't explain, and it shocks you, right? Because you don't have a framework for it in your mind. In a lot of times, and actually what's also interesting is how people deal with it, because sometimes in our brains, if we don't have like a framework for something and someone mentions something you don't understand, you don't even hear it, right? Like sometimes, and so it doesn't process because you don't know it, so it bounces off. And sometimes with ontological shock, usually, I mean, that's why, again, I said it depends on the person and their past experiences and their characteristics and all that. But some people will be like, it's too much, and they will just have to deny it because they don't feel safe. It's too much contrast. And some other people cannot let it go, right? And they're like, I need to understand what happened and what I saw and what I experienced. But it's coming up against that. Something that you're perceiving is clashing with your fundamental understanding of reality.
Yeah, the ontology is an old Greek word, and the idea is that there's a beingness that we think of as the very being of reality, like just what it basically is, what really is. And so an ontological shock is a shock about the very nature and the kind of primal level of, wait a second, what I thought was real isn't real, or what I thought couldn't be real might be. And this really can freak the system out. And this can become, again, traumatizing for people. And that's why preparation for working with these medicines is important, because the other thing that's going to happen inevitably, the wisdom traditions teach us, is that we're going to have variations of spiritual materialism. And what spiritual materialism means is that any idea, any practice, any medicine, any politics can be used to deepen and perpetuate structures of bondage and aggression, both inside of us and outside of us, rather than liberating us, even if that's their intention or their potential. So if a psychedelic medicine could liberate, or if a philosophy of a certain kind is intended to liberate you, that doesn't mean that your ego will not find ways to quickly batten down the hatches, right? Because when there's a big thing that happens, the first thing the ego wants to do is just start to wait a second, we get back under control. And then it will spin a story that it's comfortable with, but our real life in the world won't necessarily change. And so I think we see that. You mentioned ayahuasca, and I certainly think we see that with all the ayahuasca tourism, because the vine might be calling some people to the rainforest, but I suspect it's not to have a trip. I imagine it's because the rainforest is at stake. The rainforest is at risk, but most of what we're doing with ayahuasca is further degrading ecologies. And so it's such a weird thing where, like, can we hear what wants to come through? It's another good example, because, for instance, if the psychedelic wants to tell you, okay, look, your job is stupid and you need to find something else to do, but you're terrified, or that capitalism is ridiculous, we need to find a better system. Oh, no, you don't.
So in the little research that I did find on this, that came up. So there was like there is a organization, maybe the American Center for Spiritual Transformative Experiences or something. I think that's what it's called. And they have like kind of categories or like things that can happen if you have had one, and that was one of them, was like clashes between these like new spiritual values that you have acquired through your experience, and then your life, right? Like the job you have, or your values, right, and the values you've shared with the people in your community, and like yours have shifted suddenly. And so, yeah, those things that like, and that's what's really interesting about these experiences, in my opinion, is you have this like beautiful, a lot of positive aspects to it. Like, oh, now I appreciate nature. Now I understand that relationships are the most important thing, service to others. I've connected to the spiritual aspect. And then you have the difficult side of that, which is if you're not surrounded by that as well, you can come into clash with your old self, your old life. And, then the tension to like move through that it can be very challenging.
Yeah. And for you, the shift, it's interesting there in a way, because it could have been, it might have been that you were walking down the street and had, a road to Damascus moment, and, the divine appeared to you and strikes you. But it really, in a way, it's interesting that it kind of begins in a coffee cup, right? I mean, it's not this, it gave you a little bit of the ontological zing.
Yeah.
Because you didn't believe what could happen. But maybe, I know you've shared this story a million times, but for people, it's interesting in part because of the fact that it's not such I took a heroic, quote unquote, heroic dose of psychedelics. So you were drinking what my family would just call coffee, because I'm Greek. But I know in different parts of the world, some people call it Turkish, some people call it Armenian. Okay, so this is sludgy coffee.
Yes, yeah. It's like right, you keep the grounds in the cup. So when you drink the watery part of the coffee, the grounds stay in the cup, and then you flip it over, let it dry, and pictures emerge, and people can, intuitives or whoever, can read it. So my grandmother used to be very good, and my mother has been reading for our family, and she would read for me, and I didn't really believe it, but I, because my mother's a bonding thing every Sunday, why not? I mean, if she would offer it, I would never say no. But yeah, she was very good. I mean, and it took me it took me like 10 plus years to like really accept it. But she was more right than she was wrong. Like, she would just know things that there's no way that she could know. And took copious notes, and I did all my stats and all my neuroscience. And I was like, I don't know how it works, but it works. And it wasn't, I just lived in cognitive dissonance. Like, I couldn't explain it, but I accepted it. And it didn't cause problems in my life, right? It didn't like impinge until she predicted two really emotional events in my life, which one was the death of a professor that I'd worked with, and one was the ending of a relationship. And so though the death one really shook me, I would say even more so than the second event. But the second event was like the tipping point, just because I was emotionally and existentially in turmoil already. But the death really shook that was like, I was in ontological shock a little bit for a while after that, because I just couldn't understand how someone's death, it like could be known ahead of time. Like, I had a really hard time with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's very existential. I mean, that's the part of the ontological shock, when we feel that like there's something about our being, our personal being at stake once the being of reality is at stake. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too that so you were getting this sort of tap. Okay, these things are right. These things are right. For some reason, one of the things that came to mind is that when I was living in London, and I went to this bookstore, and I found out that a guy was a London journalist, was there to launch his book on Uri Geller, the famous psychic. And so this guy, he's there, and he says, look, spoon bending is just real. And I talked to U.S. military, he says. I interviewed people in the U.S. military, and they said that they used to have spoon bending parties. So for anybody who's not familiar, Uri Geller was a famous psychic, and one of the things he could do is and this is how he supposedly discovered his psychic abilities. He was eating soup, and the spoon just bent. And he was just a little boy when this happened. So then he realized he could do this on command. And so he could hold a spoon and he could just sort of touch it and the spoon could bend. Now, magicians of all kinds, James Randi and others, and you even mentioned Hyman, who was very critical, but also was a magician like Randi. That's how they got connected as skeptics. They can make spoons bend. Now, I was a magician when I was a little kid, so I know how it's done too. But so this guy was saying, no, but it's real. And he said, now I talked to people in the military, and they would say, well, it's not like we ever figured out how to get somebody to bend a tank. But the reason why we would take some of our elite soldiers, like we're talking Green Berets, people, we would bring them to a spoon bending party, is just to show them that they don't know everything that they think they know. That reality itself, let alone situations on the battlefield, can be extremely surprising. And it was just to give them that little taste of ontological shock. And then what was funny is that through a weird circumstance, I didn't know Uri Geller was going to be there. I didn't know the guy was going to be launching his book, but Uri Geller came to the book launch and was in the audience, and then he spoke for a few minutes. And then the journalist says, does anybody have a spoon? Thinking that, of course, anyone who would come knows about Uri Geller and probably... Yeah. I was the only person in the audience who just randomly had a spoon on me.
Oh my gosh.
And that's because of an artist I dated randomly. This is like a weird random story. But I had been dating this artist, and she accused me of being very functional. And so we were in a coffee shop at the time that she said that. And I said, oh, yeah? What function does it serve to throw the spoon into my backpack?
How funny.
And I had just left this spoon in my backpack for like a year. And I knew that it was in there. And so I said, well, I've got a spoon. I reached in and here's the spoon that I had thrown in as a joke. And Uri Geller walked right over to me, right in front of me, and held the spoon. Now, again, I did magic as a kid. I'm happy to admit I was a little magic nerd. And he just like stroked that spoon and I watched it bend, and there was no sleight of hand. It wasn't even an attempted sleight of hand. I handed it to him. It was clean. Yeah. But it's just so interesting how you could see something like that and then actually just go, wow, that was really crazy, and walk away.
Yes, exactly.
And so you were getting tapped constantly, gosh, my mom is right. Look at me being a neuroscientist, and I'm trying to track this, and I don't have any explanation. Whatever. Yeah. But then something had to step in to kind of take hold of you.
Yeah. Yeah. To shock. Yeah, really. Yeah. Even after the death, it's actually interesting with the death, I was scared. And that was part of why I didn't want to think about it, because it scared me too much. And then I did ignore it. I was just freaked out by it. And I thought, I don't know, but I'm not going to look into this. And I was also very busy, so it just worked out that way. But then the next time, the next time I was too curious. Then I got curious. Then I thought, well, you know what? This is weird.
And there's a broken openness when our heart breaks of whatever kind. There's, I mean, Rumi even describes that as a kind of the broken openness that leads to spirituality, because we have to feel like sometimes we have to reach a kind of bottom of the barrel in some way, because otherwise it is easy to write off, and it's you're something in you. Like you could say the unconscious parts of the ego that do control our experience in ways that we're not aware of, that part of you knew that it was going to be uncomfortable to have to sit through all that. Like it could foresee you on the floor going, I'm an idiot. Everyone's going to think I'm stupid, right? Yeah. And so to be able to go through that, it's just so interesting. I think it's just,
that's very true. Yeah. It's, I mean, I knew you're unconsciously for sure, but even consciously, I knew it would be hard, and it would be, and just in terms of how my life, went, it was much more convenient actually for it to happen when it did, because when I think right when I was in the middle, when I decided to start the project was when COVID hit and we had the lockdown, and not having to, drive to the office and do the work 9 to 5 in the office, allowed me to have more, flexibility with my schedule and just have more time in the day. Right. To do those interviews, like during off work hours. So, that worked out, because otherwise my schedule was so insane. Like before COVID, I worked more than 9 to 5. So I would have had no time or energy to do that.
Yeah, because in LA, everything's a commute. First of all, like you go to the grocery store as a commute, but that in general, I mean, I do think this is part of how the pattern of insanity perpetuates itself, because John Maynard Keynes, it's not that long ago when he was saying, Oh yeah, by the beginning of the 21st century, the people are going to work 15 hours a week. Now, why didn't that happen?
Yeah,
And
why
you can
not?
have all sorts of explanations, but is it in part that the immune system of the pattern that we're trapped in says, no, if these people have free time, who knows what they'll pay attention to?
Right.
So it's
Yeah,
very
maybe.
convenient to be too busy to turn toward the mysterious, because if the mysterious calls you into a different view of reality and your place in reality than what is comfortable in the system that needs you to degrade it and treat it as matter that doesn't matter,
Mhm.
then it's much better to be busy.
Yeah, and it's well, yeah, and the busier you are, the less you can think about how miserable you are, which is what I was in,
Yeah,
the situation I found myself in, and I think a lot of people did. And then when you were suddenly had to sit at home quarantined, you're like, wait a minute, this is great to have extra time in my day, and I'm doing all the same work I did in the office. Why do I need to be there? And like, in fact, I would do more work because nobody would come interrupt, and talk to
right,
me and waste my
right.
time. So, yeah, I agree. And
It's complex, isn't it? Because on the one hand, what would be great is if we had, this is what's so interesting about Bateson's work and understanding mind as an ecology. In a healthy ecology of mind, the person coming to interrupt you actually becomes a source of inspiration. And of course, that does happen even in ordinary offices. That's why Steve Jobs designed,
right.
famously designed Apple the way he did. I mean, I don't see Steve Jobs as a visionary, but he did understand that you had these chance encounters. Chomsky talks about that in the building he was at MIT, where he said, like across the
Right.
hall's an
Yes.
astrophysicist, what
Yeah,
we'd otherwise never talk.
that's right.
But you're right that again, a part of what the way our ecologies function is to constrain that in a certain way, so that a lot of things are simply interruptions. It's
Yeah.
so interesting that the way the crazy has to be a self-sustaining event or process. It has to keep itself, or else who knows what comes out of it.
Yeah, and I've always thought about work and our economy. And I mean, I'm not an economist, so I don't understand anything, but like I've always thought about it a lot, and I never resonated, none of it resonated with me ever. I always had trouble existentially, which is why I think like just every year that went by, this like thing was building up inside of me of just like really no better way to describe it than it was so out of resonance with me. Like it hurt me to like go in and like conform to these stupid rules that we have to do, or like just to be in the office, or just to attend, or just I don't know, just all the stupid things we had to do. And for me, the quarantine was great because it finally was a chance to break and like look at that and
Yeah,
sit with a different reality, and just be like, this is how, not that that is how it should be. There should definitely be more balance between the two, but yeah,
yeah,
just that there should be a different way.
yeah. That's so interesting too, that just to be open enough to our own suffering. And because I often say too that there are two things going on. One is, can we be open enough and honest enough about our own fear of what reality might be like, the parts that we're not sure about, because that's a common response that people will have to an ontological shock, even people who are looking for it or are interested. And past episodes on that, William James, who was very interested, he describes being shaken to his core, absolute terror at being exposed to a broader reality. And this was a person who was really interested in it. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer talks about that too, that in one case of having a kind of psychic experience, she was fine with it. But in another case, it really, the ontological shock was there and it caused terror. And it happens again and again. But then the other part is having enough sensitivity to our suffering in general to recognize that we really aren't happy and that something in us wants a different world than the one, because we're not really intending to perpetuate ecological destruction and injustice and inequality. Our participation in it then almost comes with a guilt. We're like, well, every day of my life, I'm doing things
Right.
that
Yeah.
really, it's not like I
Mhm.
want to do that, but I am doing it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It, you said something and I wanted to, oh no, but it's just slipped my mind. But it was,
Might come
what,
back.
what were you talking about just before this?
I don't know. You mean before I just
uh,
talked about the fear and the suffering in us,
Oh, I
or
remember. I remember.
yeah,
Okay, it was
okay.
this. So there was this paper that was just published about challenging psychedelic experiences, but that
Yeah.
showed that so like I said, this is the research that's starting to be done of like the more longer term outcomes and like what are the challenging things and are there persistent perceptual changes or emotional changes or so there were this paper came out and they did a nice job of laying out what are the drugs that cause this, how long do these usually last, what are the things. But what was really interesting was that they then asked the participants, did you find it to be like a positive, meaningful experience in the end? And of all the people who reported that, I think it was like 85 or 89% said it was like a in the end, it was a meaningful, positive experience, even though it was challenging. And then half of them, I think, said that they would do psychedelics again. So I think half said they wouldn't. It was a pretty large number that wouldn't, or that like have no plans to do it again right now. But half would. But the 80 to 90% that found it meaningful, I think, highlights something really interesting that I'm noticing too in our culture of like Western culture is very, I mean, even though there is a lot of like stuff in pop culture about resilience, but when it comes to stuff like the idea behind, oh, if you have a challenging psychedelic experience, like it can be positive for you. Like I think in medicine there's a lot of fear around around that kind of thing. So like in the psychedelic space there's a lot of conversation around like, well, how do we prevent challenging experiences? But then like in the new medical framework, but in the old, like the people who've been like Stan Groff, who studied LSD psychotherapy from the 50s or through the 70s until it was banned, they're like, hello, the challenging experiences are the best ones for people. Like when people work through it, those end up being the most meaningful and the most healing for people. And then, but in Western culture, you have this like no protection of like from anything negative. Like let's protect you from triggers and let's protect you from this challenging experience. And, to some extent, I get it because again, like we're talking about, like it can be really deeply upsetting, like to have a worldview flip or to whatever happens in psychedelics, right? Like face the devil in hell or whatever, you get trapped in the cycle of existence or whatnot. But what's actually valuable is learning to work through that, and learning to sit through the experience, learning to breathe through. It'll be over, it may not feel like it will, that trip will end. And the same with a spiritual experience, like it will end and then you will work through, you'll find a way to work through what has happened, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I think there's not enough of that understanding
Mm.
that we can do it. Like it's okay, we
Yeah.
can do it, like we can make it through.
Yeah, well, and the how. I mean, this is the issue that the wisdom traditions teach you. I mean, I would obviously they're within a certain. I understand that you were making a kind of contextualized claim. The challenging experiences are often necessary. They're not necessarily the best ones we'll have, but you're right. The wisdom traditions are saying, don't just go through a challenging experience. Let us teach you how to work with a difficult experience. That's
Mhm.
what their orientation is. Let us show you how the painful becomes a gateway to liberation. That the bad news, seemingly bad news from the ego standpoint, is actually the good news. How do you make the
Right.
bad news into the good news? And they're saying there are practices. Don't just chance it. Don't just go through the difficult experience, because they're saying you'll leave something on the table. Yeah, you'll come out the other side thinking it was good, but there's more if you will let us teach you how to work with it. And even in the archetypal story of Buddha, you have that, right? Because he has to go through, the first thing that happens when he sits under that tree is that he gets confronted with both intense fear and intense craving. Those are the
Mhm.
two of the things that happen, right? That Mara launches this massive assault, in addition to tempting him with sensuality. So first is the craving, the sensuality, and he's able to sit through that, which is seemingly good, but you still have to know how to work with it. And he shows he does work with it. And then comes this huge existential threat. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to destroy you. And he's able to sit through that difficult. and then sit through all of his past lives, which depends on how we want to look at that, right? I mean, you are clearly, you've looked at evidence where you say, man, this is hard to understand if you don't think that we didn't have a past life. And from the Buddhist point of view, they see spiritual progress in general as hard to fully comprehend unless you do it across lifetimes, because the odds of being a Buddha this life is slim for most of us.
Right.
So they feel that should be, but that means that he had to look at really difficult deaths, really difficult lives that he went through, and be able to sit through a lot of difficult things. And that's, in fact, why he developed some of the training that he did, because he had people who he could not just teach them meditation. He had to say, okay, you before you do that, can we lay this other foundation so that you know how to work with difficult experiences and trauma, what we would call trauma now. It's all really good stuff. It's all really exciting. But I think we've come to the end of our time. So I want to just offer you, are there any final reflections, thoughts, anything else? Anything. I know it's always sometimes it's too open ended.
Yeah. I don't know. I just try to stay. I try to stay open now to ideas. So I don't know. I always tell everyone to just stay curious, and it's hard, right? Like even for me, like being on this journey, I kept imagining like this, like I kept extending my belief box, like a box of beliefs, and like it would expand out to include more and more and more, but I would keep drawing lines and being like, okay, this is where I'm not willing to cross the line. And I mean, just that experience has helped me understand other people, and where they're coming from, and when they're so resistant to something I'm talking about. And I try to just keep that in mind, that all you can do is you're going to come up against people in their belief boxes, and you can't force it open. So just like keep that in mind as you interact with other people about these things.
Yeah. And I think it's beautiful. And I'll say again to everybody who's listening or watching, this is a really good book to read, because Mona just does such a good job at looking at not just one set of phenomena, but a wide range of phenomena. I don't know that I've seen a book that looks at such a wide range and also tries to consider the real limitations, the real facts on the ground of how science is conducted, that it's affected by larger structures that can constrain it, that it's affected by a metaphysical speculation about the nature of reality, and that it's a genuine struggle that other people share, that other scientists have talked about. Jung struggled with this, but this real struggle to not want to look like somebody who's gullible or foolish or simple-minded, and yet to confront evidence. And so you're consistently looking at evidence that doesn't fit the paradigm. And what am I supposed to do as a scientist if I've got evidence? And that's what I was the ideal is that's what I'm supposed to be looking at. So this is not some tour of further metaphysical speculation. It is evidence against the metaphysical speculation of the dominant paradigm we have. And I think it's just, you did a really wonderful job. It's accessible, it's easy to read, it's fun, and it's a broad sweep of all kinds of cool things, from reincarnation to telepathy, remote viewing. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun to write. Not fun to go through, but it was fun to write.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I look forward to maybe another dialogue at some point. So, as you go further into some of these things, and we can kind of keep in touch and see what
great.
You're
this
into.
Was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all of you for joining in. If you have stories or questions, reflections to share about the nature of mind, the nature of reality, and things that create ontological shock, maybe you've experienced one or know somebody who has, please send it in through dangerouswisdom.org. We might be able to bring some of that into a future contemplation. Until then, this is Dr. Nikos, your friendly neighborhood soul doctor, reminding you that your soul and the soul of the world are not two things. Take good care.